Let's save the date. More powerful parenting on this episode of Pushback.
Go, Jonny, go, go. Go, Jonny, go, go. Go, Jonny, go, go.
If you're concerned about the direction our culture is heading, then maybe it's time to push back.
Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Jonny, and this is another episode of Pushback. As promised, I wanted to jump back into my powerful parenting series, and I appreciate people's comments and feedbacks on this topic because I believe it is so important and so critical as parents that we understand what our children are facing. Before I get into the topic, though, if you're watching on YouTube, you will see that I'm wearing the Jamestown Jimmy gear. Now, my daughter, Maggie, has received an athletic scholarship from Jamestown in middle of North Dakota to play volleyball there. And yesterday we found out that the team this year has just won the national championship for the NAIA. So that was very, very encouraging and exciting to learn and to watch. And congratulations to Coach John and that whole team that we've gotten to know a little bit as Maggie was being recruited. And but she will be going to the defending national champion next year, and so that's pretty exciting for sure. So I got my Go Jimmy's gear on today, and very excited to give that announcement. We can't get swept away by the culture. Obviously, that's a theme of this podcast, is that we aren't just helpless victims just bobbing down the river of culture. No, we're actually the ones that plant our feet and sometimes have to go against the current and stand up for what is right and stand up for what is healthy culture. See, because we're really all after the same thing, and that's health for ourselves, for our children, for our families. Isn't that what everybody wants? And so the world shifts and changes by whatever is valued at the time. Well, biblical culture isn't set up that way. It's set on truth. And truth is a realm given to us by the Almighty God and embodied in Jesus himself. He said, I am the truth. And so we can take that to the bank. We have the highest way. He said, my ways are higher than your ways. And so we can follow him with the assurance that his way is the superior way. He doesn't give us boundaries and ways of living to constrict us or to take all the joy out of living. He does that so that we are safe and protected and that we actually live healthy. And within a boundary, we can live with perfect freedom and joy. And that's how he designed it to be. My wife and I talk a lot about common versus normal. And so as I get into the topic today about dating and the pressure of dating and sex before marriage, especially in our younger children and in those teenage years, the pressure that is there is strong, and it's compelling for our children. And we as parents need to be equally as compelling and strong, declaring truth over our children so that they know what to say, they know how to stand up for what is right, and they know how to live within a loving boundary, because that's what we want for them. Now, the culture today is telling us that everything is physical and emotional or feelings. And so it doesn't take long to turn on a Hollywood movie and two people that barely know each other say, hey, how are you? And the next scene, they're in bed together. And because they are just responding to a feeling or to an emotion or to a physical connectedness. And of course, that's not what we want. That's not God's best. And we can all agree on that. But Hollywood is conveying that as normal culture. It's common culture, but it's not normal culture. He actually set up perfect normal for us in the Garden of Eden. And he gave us constraints. He gave us self-control. He gave us boundaries in which we are to live, because outside those boundaries, we actually become sick. Now, I want you to reference with this podcast, if you're a parent really needing to dig into this topic, my previous podcast called Shifting Relationship Paradigms. I really want you to lean into that, maybe even write it down. I like flowcharts and go through those with your kids. I also did a podcast called Soul Ties, which will tie into what we're talking about today. And then I did a whole series on what I entitled Sexual Revolution at the end of last season, at the end of season 2. And I encourage you to go back and listen to those with your kids, especially your teenage kids. There's obviously sexual content in there, but I believe it's completely appropriate for teenage kids and essential that they listen to that. Now, I understand, I do understand that there are hormones at play and attraction and things that children are drawn into, and that doesn't change as we become adults. It's just that there is a maturity level that we need to be concerned about with our children. And so, yes, last week I talked about, shifting relationship paradigms. And of course, that applied to all ages as we walk through an appropriate, mature relationship with somebody without all the baggage and the pain that would go into a relationship. Doesn't mean there won't ever be pain and there won't ever be baggage. But if we're smart, if we're able to manage this and see it how God sees us, I believe we can walk through these in a more healthy way. And so when we're talking about our children, and really to drill down more, our teenage children, we have to take into account maturity levels or lack thereof. Don't you find it interesting that we as a society and often as parents are permissive in regards to relationships of young people, high school sweethearts, if you would? And so many of those kids are having physical relationships as well. And we can have two 16-year-olds engaging in sex or premarital relationship in that regard. And yet, if a 21-year-old would have sex with a 16-year-old, that's called rape. You ever scratch your head and go, wait a minute, what's going on here? Well, it's because we as a society have recognized the fact that kids aren't completely mature when they are teenagers. There's a vulnerability there, and older adults can prey on that vulnerability. And yet, we have these relationships in high school between teenagers, both immature, and we foster and sometimes even encourage these relationships and not understand that there's equal consequences there because of the maturity levels. I won't go into any great detail, but you probably have heard about the frontal lobe. It's part of our brain that doesn't become mature until we get into our 20s, and especially for men, a little bit later than women. You can insert your comment there. But frontal lobe, when we're talking about reasoning and common sense, impulse control, these are the things that haven't fully developed yet. And yet we sit back and let those without impulse control try to navigate adult relationships. Oh my goodness. My friends, it doesn't work all that well, and it isn't meant to, because they are too young to fully appreciate what they're doing and the gravity of the physical relationship. But there's still physical attraction, there's still feelings, and as long as they're connected just to those two things, they can proceed with relationships. But I would like to submit to you that that's careless, it's dangerous, causes pain and hurt. And when we talk about soul ties that I've talked about before, soul ties are those emotional connections that take place between a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or in a relationship where we open up our soul, we open up our mind, will, and emotions to each other, and then we actually open up our bodies to each other. And the Bible is very clear how there is an exchange of emotion, an exchange of soul that takes place called a soul tie. Not all soul ties are bad. There are good, healthy soul ties between husbands and wives and between parents and children and siblings, that we all have deep emotional ties to those people. Those are called healthy soul ties. But there are unhealthy soul ties when we connect with people in whom we're not committed to. There's a man named Joshua Harris who wrote a very well-read book called I Kiss Dating Goodbye. My goal with this podcast is not to break that book down completely, but I pulled out some excerpts that he had written and wrote that I feel like are so insightful. And I want to have you connect to what he said, because I think it helps reiterate what I'm talking about here. He wrote, most kids grow up thinking that dating is an essential part of being a teenager. It's called culture. That's what he's referring to. To them, life is a series of one girlfriend or boyfriend after another, which really amounts to one heartache after another. A 2-year relationship seems like a long commitment. Even those who make it through the junior high and senior high years with their sexual purity intact will often emerge with damaged emotions, bitterness, and cynicism. To be sure, much of the damage may have been inflicted by the individuals involved, but likewise, the system itself is faulty. Now, I love sentences like that, and those of you who have been listening to me for seasons upon seasons know that I love sentences like that because that's a cultural sentence, that the system itself is faulty. There's something that's broken. I talked about in the Sexual Revolution series about how we've really had a 50-year test tube where we've observed sort of a free love, do what feels good society. And how is that working out for us? It's devastation. The depression, anxiety levels are through the roof. Well, if that was such a utopia to not put boundaries around people and let people just freely express themselves, if that was supposed to be such a utopia, why aren't people generally happier? Why aren't we living more free? Because it doesn't work. It's not the right boundary. The Father gives us boundaries. When we live outside the boundaries, we actually become sick. And we see that relationally. We see that in statistics, even in marriage and relationally between our citizens, that it's dysfunctional at its very core. I want to give you a really important statistic if you're a parent listening to this podcast and have either preteens or teenagers. 1% of high school sweethearts actually marry each other. That's 1%. That means 99% of your children who date somebody while in high school will date somebody that they will not marry. That should really be compelling enough to say a couple things. One is they aren't mature enough to even think or plan or have a trajectory towards marriage. So they aren't looking for a committed long-term relationship. They're just looking for something that feels good, that makes them feel accepted or popular or treasured or valued. Something else than what a relationship is actually for. And that statistic should also tell us that it's not worth the investment, the heart investment that takes place when these young people try to navigate something that they are too young to navigate. So I often hear, and this is the part that just makes me so sad and continues to drive me to do this podcast, but I hear parents say things like, I've heard all of these, by the way, quote, kids are going to do what kids are going to do. Or, I remember what it was like. I made those mistakes. I turned out okay. Or kids need to learn from their consequences. Or they won't listen to me anyway. I could go on and on about how parents are told or have believed the lie that they are simply supposed to resign their position. If parents really believe those quotes, then what the heck do they need parents for? Parents are the ones who are supposed to inject themselves into their lives and offer them guidance, offer them wisdom, offer them boundaries so that they are safe and they are free. Parents are told to resign. The world is telling us that there's other things that can drive the decisions of children. Parents should be more hands-off. I will not take that stand. I don't believe that is the right stand. I believe that this podcast, GoFam Ministries, this is all about promoting powerful parents to sit in that seat of parenthood where they can help and guide and direct their children. That's what you are there for. That's what you are there for. Joshua Harris gave a list of 7 things about dating that he sees as a problem. And I just want to go through these because I think this is so well thought out and gives a little bit of a structure for this conversation. Number one, he says that dating leads to intimacy, but not necessarily to commitment. And how could or why would a child or a teenager even be thinking about commitment? They're just looking to feel intimate. Number two, it tends to skip the friendship stage of a relationship. That's exactly what I talked about last week. I feel so good that he wrote that because I believe that the friendship stage is such an important position, such an important place, should occupy the greatest amount of time. And I'm going to be so bold in this podcast to say should be the entirety of a junior high or high school relationship. It's simply the friendship stage. It doesn't need to go beyond that. We'll talk about that more in a second. Number three, it often mistakes a physical relationship for love. Oh boy. Isn't that the truth though? Isn't that what the world is telling us? Isn't that what Hollywood is showing us? Isn't that at the root? That feelings rule the day. Feelings rule the day. Harris wrote, I was primarily interested in what I could get, such as the popularity a girlfriend could give me or the comfort and pleasure I could gain physically or emotionally from a relationship. Choosing what felt good for me instead of what was good for others or what pleased God. Is that what we want for our kids? My friends, that is the decisions that these young people are making every single day. And we as parents are simply going to resign and sit back and say, well, that's just what kids do. It's destructive, it's not healthy, and it bears no fruit. Number four, often isolates a couple from other vital relationships. And don't we see that all the time? Where there's this relationship or even this young relationship with children or with teenagers, it actually becomes all-consuming because that's what the world tells you that it should be. You should be spending all time together, and parents and siblings and other vital relationships then get pushed aside. Number five, in many cases, it distracts young adults from their primary responsibility of preparing for the future. What an important sentence that is. Let me read it again. In many cases, it distracts young people from their primary responsibility of preparing for the future. It's actually sitting in the seat that the Lord gives you as a young adult, as a teenager, as a junior high student, is sitting in that place where the Lord is fashioning you and forming you and preparing you and dreaming over you and equipping you for the things that you are called for and called to. Number six, can cause discontentment with God's gift of singleness. It's so right and it's so true. There will be a time when the Holy Spirit calls you into relationship potentially. But where we're sitting right now as a teenager, as a single person, it's a unique opportunity. Paul talks about this all the time, unique opportunity to be connected to the voice of God, to learn his voice, to hear his voice. See, this is a cultural pressure. And my friends, it's real. It's real. Having raised teenagers, I get it. It's real. There's a pull in society and in culture for you to continually be looking for somebody to, quote, complete you, somebody to be part of your life. Who's the next cute person that's going to come into your life? And it's all consuming. It's all relationship oriented. And there's a discontentment with God's gift of singleness. It's real and it's dangerous. And number seven, it creates an artificial environment for evaluating another person's character. Well, this is key. And social media, by definition, is an artificial environment. But also entering into a relationship at such a young age or at an immature age actually inhibits you from actually connecting with the true person's character. I like to call it the interview effect. My wife and I talk about this often. Is that when somebody's interviewing for a job, anybody can look great in an interview. It's when you're getting them in real life, when you're getting them in real circumstances. That's the key. See, dating is not evil. I believe when it's done right within boundaries, it's actually a critical stage, as I talked about last week, of a mature, healthy relationship. So what is the answer to overcoming these cultural norms of dating? See, I want to just refresh your memory of the stages I talked about yesterday. I had a question for each stage, and the dating stage question is this someone I want to marry? My friends, a 16-year-old can't answer this question no matter how mature they are. And we as parents wouldn't want them to even be thinking about that yet. And so if they can't answer it, shouldn't be answering it, no value for answering it, then they're not ready. It's really that simple. And I'm willing to take a fairly hard stand on this podcast and say that that is the litmus test. Where I believe that it's inappropriate for junior high and senior high kids to be dating each other. They're not in that mature phase enough to handle a mature relationship. And it often leads to heartache and pain and sin. Now, again, I'm not trying to be some kind of Puritan and shake my fist and try to lock our kids in the cellar. I get that there's real life and real feelings and real emotions and real hormones. I get all of that. So what is the answer to overcoming the cultural norms of dating? The things that this world is coming at us against? And my answer is time. If you're taking notes, write down this word, time. Time is the answer. Kids don't like this. They don't like having to wait. They don't like needing to be patient. Why? Because it's counter-cultural. The world is saying now, you're going to miss out. Hurry up. Why aren't you like other people? You got to take advantage of your situation. But time is a key, I believe. There's a patience that's involved. And when we're talking about our teenagers, time exposes a few things. I love asking, why are you in such a hurry? That question actually reveals a heart, because that's hard for them to answer. Other than with a selfish, self-serving answer. I need, I want, I can't wait. It also, time reveals motives. Motives. Maybe it's possible that somebody is wanting something else other than a relationship, if you know what I mean. If you implement time, if you offer patience, if you say, well, maybe someday we'll date, it actually reveals the motives of the heart. If there's a young man that wants to date a girl for all the wrong reasons, he's not going to wait. He's not going to be patient. It actually reveals the heart. There was one of my daughters, I will not use any names in this story, who had a young man who was interested in her. And so I said to this young man, well, why don't you call me and we'll talk. And so he called. He was very respectful about it. And I said, well, here's the story. I said, I don't really know you. I'm not even sure my daughter really knows you. So why don't you come over to our house? We'll pull out some board games. We'll spend some time together to get to know you. And we'll see if you guys even want to spend time together, if you even want to be friends. And he was very respectful and said, well, that sounds great. Well, guess what? We never heard from him again. He wasn't interested in investing time in our family or getting to know each other. Most likely interested in other things, having a girlfriend. You see, time actually reveals something. Time actually overcomes the interview effect, that anybody can look good for a little while thing. If you inject time in a more prolonged friendship type relationship, it actually reveals some true nature of people. Nobody can conceal things forever. And I don't mean that all in negatives either. Both positives and negatives, where you see people in their real environment. And my last comment about time is that if it's meant to be, it'll still be there. 1% of those relationships actually do go on to marriage. And guess what? They don't have to date during high school in order for that to happen. They can still be friends and maintain a friendship relationship, so when they are mature and when the time is right, the relationship is there. And for the other 99%, the right one is still yet down the road when they are older and their frontal lobe has developed. There needs to be much more time in the friendship category. So I would argue that there is no real place for dating in high school. That's a pretty big, bold statement, and I would like to hear your response to that. I can take it if you don't agree with me. I want to hear your heart and your response as a parent. I would highly recommend crazy, tight boundaries where people are operating in groups and in friendships and not being alone. There's just no need for it. And I think it's so important, as I've been doing this powerful parenting series, that our kids are able to not only take a stand, but take the stand to actually get cross-examined by questioning, because they will be questioned. Because if they wait, if they implement time, if they implement prolonged friendships, they're going to get questions. They're going to get looks. They're going to maybe even be teased. I get all of that. But it's much easier to talk to your children about this even before they start entering or consider entering into relationships. Try to be consistent with all of your children because they pay attention to that very closely. So do the best you can with that. Not every child is the same, and not every child operates on the same maturity plane or level. That's true. But try to be consistent with the ideals and the culture that you're creating for your family. And your kids can stand up for this. Your kids can see the value in it. And your kids don't want to enter into something that's going to hurt them or cause pain. And if it's meant to be, if this is somebody who the Lord is really drawing them to, they will still be there after a period of time. I'm very curious about your comments and your responses to this. Go to pushbackculture.org, and leave your message or comment or concern. And I would love to get back to you or entertain that question on a future podcast. Thanks for listening to me again. It's my pleasure to share my heart. I find chatting with you to be such a thrill and a pleasure and a privilege of mine. So let's go together now to set and shape the culture.